Welcome to the hidden world of the Book of Jubilees, also called the Little Genesis. This isn't just another apocryphal text gathering dust in academic circles. This is a book that challenges everything you think you know about biblical chronology, the origin of evil, and the very nature of divine law. What if I told you there's an ancient book that completely rewrites the timeline of Genesis, reveals secrets about fallen angels, and claims God commanded Moses to write down events that were already recorded in heaven before creation began? A book so controversial that it was deliberately removed from most Bibles, yet so profound that entire communities still consider it sacred scripture today. And if you're curious about uncovering these biblical mysteries that have been hidden for centuries, make sure to subscribe, because we're diving deep into texts that most people never hear about in church. The Book of Jubilees presents itself as a direct revelation from God to Moses on Mount Sinai, claiming to reveal the true chronology of events from creation to the giving of the law. But here's what makes it dangerous to traditional interpretations. It doesn't just retell familiar stories, it reframes them entirely. It introduces a completely different calendar system, places laws centuries before they were supposedly given, and presents a view of angelic rebellion that makes the brief mention in Genesis look like a footnote. Scholars like R.H. Charles, who spent decades studying this text, called it one of the most important books for understanding Second Temple Judaism. Yet James Vanderkam, another leading expert, notes how this book creates profound tensions with accepted biblical chronology. Why? Because Jubilees doesn't just fill in gaps in the biblical narrative. It suggests those gaps were intentionally created to hide deeper truths. Consider this startling claim from the text. God tells Moses that everything he's about to write was already recorded on heavenly tablets before the world was created. This isn't just predestination theology. This is something far more radical. It's claiming that the entire biblical narrative, including human choices and divine responses, was scripted in heaven before time began. The psychological impact of this concept is staggering. If everything was already written, what does that mean for free will, for prayer, for the very nature of relationship with God? But let's start with something that might seem mundane, but is actually revolutionary: time itself. The Book of Jubilees introduces a calendar that challenges the very foundation of how we understand biblical chronology. Instead of the lunar calendar that became standard in Jewish practice, Jubilees insists on a solar calendar of exactly 364 days, perfectly divisible by 7, ensuring that every holy day falls on the same day of the week every year. This wasn't just an academic exercise. The Essenes at Qumran, who preserved copies of this book, were obsessed with this calendar because they believed the temple in Jerusalem had corrupted time itself. Imagine the implications. They believed that the entire religious establishment was worshipping on the wrong days, celebrating festivals at the wrong times, and living out of sync with divine rhythm. If you're finding this fascinating and want to explore more hidden biblical texts, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what other mysterious books you'd like me to investigate. The calendar controversy reveals something deeper about the Book of Jubilees. It's not content to simply retell biblical history. It's making an accusation. It's claiming that somewhere along the way, the true divine order was abandoned for human convenience and political control. The text presents this as a cosmic tragedy, with humanity living in temporal exile from God's intended rhythm. But the calendar is just the beginning. The Book of Jubilees tackles the most mysterious passage in early Genesis, the brief mention of the sons of God taking wives among the daughters of men and producing giants called the Nephilim. While Genesis mentions this in passing, Jubilees provides a detailed account that reads like a cosmic horror story. According to Jubilees, these weren't just random encounters. This was a coordinated rebellion by a group of angels called Watchers, who were supposed to observe humanity, but instead chose to corrupt it. The text describes how these beings taught humans forbidden knowledge, the arts of war, cosmetics, astrology, and magic. But here's the twist that modern theology often avoids. Jubilees suggests that evil didn't begin with Adam and Eve's disobedience. It began with angelic rebellion that preceded and influenced the fall in Eden. This completely reframes the story of redemption. If evil was already present in the world through angelic corruption before humans ever faced temptation, then the nature of human sinfulness and divine justice looks very different. It suggests that humanity was born into a world already contaminated by cosmic rebellion, making the human condition even more tragic and divine grace even more necessary. The psychological impact of this perspective is profound. Instead of viewing evil as something that entered the world through human choice, Jubilees presents it as a cosmic infection that predates human existence. This makes human beings both less culpable for the origin of evil and more dependent on divine intervention for redemption. It's a view that simultaneously humbles human responsibility and magnifies divine mercy. But perhaps the most controversial aspect of the Book of Jubilees is its claim about the antiquity of divine law. The text insists that the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were already observing the Sabbath, practicing circumcision, and celebrating the festivals centuries before these were supposedly given to Moses at Sinai. This creates a theological earthquake. If the patriarchs were already following the law, then what exactly happened at Sinai? Was Moses receiving new revelation or simply codifying eternal principles that righteous people had always known? Jubilees suggests that divine law isn't something that was created at a specific moment in history. Instead, it's an eternal reality that gets revealed progressively as humanity becomes ready to receive it. The book presents this through a striking metaphor. God shows Moses heavenly tablets that contain the record of everything that has happened and will happen. But these tablets existed before creation. This suggests that the law itself is part of the fundamental structure of reality, not a set of arbitrary rules imposed on creation. This perspective challenges both Jewish and Christian approaches to understanding the relationship between law and grace, between Old Testament and New Testament, between divine command and human nature. If the law represents eternal divine reality rather than temporary human necessity, then our entire understanding of biblical theology needs reconsideration. The implications extend beyond academic theology into practical spirituality. If righteousness precedes commandment, if holy people naturally align with divine law before it's formally revealed, then the relationship between faith and obedience looks very different. It suggests that transformation of heart naturally produces alignment with divine will, rather than external compliance producing internal change. But why was this book rejected by mainstream Jewish and Christian communities if it contains such profound insights? The answer reveals the complex relationship between spiritual authority and political control in religious communities. If you're enjoying this deep dive into biblical mysteries and want to see more content like this, make sure you're subscribed and ring that notification bell so you don't miss future explorations of hidden religious texts. The rejection of Jubilees wasn't primarily based on theological concerns. It was based on authority concerns. The book presents itself as direct divine revelation to Moses, equal in authority to the Torah itself. This created problems for religious leaders who wanted to maintain control over scriptural interpretation. If Jubilees was accepted as authentic, it would mean that significant theological concepts had been hidden from or ignored by mainstream religious tradition. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which still includes Jubilees in its biblical canon, offers a different perspective. Ethiopian scholars argue that the book provides essential context for understanding the deeper meanings of Genesis and Exodus. They suggest that without Jubilees, readers miss crucial information about the cosmic background of biblical events, the true chronology of divine revelation, and the eternal nature of divine law. This raises uncomfortable questions for other Christian traditions. If a significant branch of historic Christianity has preserved texts that other branches rejected, how do we determine which tradition has maintained authentic biblical teaching? The Ethiopian preservation of Jubilees suggests that our understanding of what constitutes biblical canon might be more culturally conditioned than divinely determined. Archaeological discoveries at Qumran have complicated this picture even further. The Dead Sea Scrolls included multiple copies of the Book of Jubilees, suggesting it was considered highly authoritative by at least some Second Temple Jewish communities. These weren't fringe groups preserving heretical texts. These were serious religious communities deeply committed to scriptural fidelity. The Qumran evidence suggests that during the time when Judaism was developing its canonical boundaries, there was significant disagreement about which books deserved inclusion. The communities that preserved Jubilees believed they were maintaining authentic biblical tradition against corruption and compromise in the Jerusalem establishment. This historical context reveals something crucial about the nature of scriptural authority. The books we consider biblical canon weren't determined by a single divine pronouncement. They were determined through complex historical processes involving theological, political, and cultural factors. Understanding this doesn't diminish scriptural authority, but it does complicate simple assumptions about how that authority was established and maintained. The Book of Jubilees forces us to confront the possibility that significant biblical truths have been marginalized or forgotten by mainstream religious tradition. It challenges comfortable assumptions about the completeness of our biblical understanding and the adequacy of conventional theological frameworks. But perhaps most significantly, Jubilees presents a vision of divine revelation that is both more comprehensive and more mysterious than what we typically encounter in religious education. It suggests that God's communication with humanity involves layers of meaning and multiple levels of understanding that can't be captured in simple doctrinal formulations. The book's claim that everything was recorded on heavenly tablets before creation presents a view of divine omniscience that goes beyond mere foreknowledge. It suggests that from God's perspective, all of history is simultaneously present and complete. This has profound implications for understanding prayer, divine response, human choice, and the nature of time itself. If you're finding these concepts challenging and want to explore more texts that push the boundaries of conventional biblical understanding, let me know in the comments what other books or topics you'd like me to investigate. And don't forget to like this video if you're appreciating this deep dive into one of history's most controversial religious texts. The psychological and spiritual implications of the Jubilees worldview are staggering. It presents humanity as existing within a cosmic drama that began before creation and extends beyond history. It suggests that our individual choices and experiences are part of a larger narrative that we can only partially comprehend from our temporal perspective. This creates both humility and hope. Humility because it acknowledges that our understanding of divine purposes is necessarily limited by our finite perspective. Hope because it suggests that even our struggles and failures are part of a larger divine plan that ultimately serves redemptive purposes. The Book of Jubilees also presents a view of spiritual warfare that is more complex and cosmic than what we typically encounter in popular Christianity. The conflict between good and evil isn't just about human moral choices. It's about cosmic forces that preceded humanity and continue to influence the conditions within which human choices are made. This perspective doesn't diminish human responsibility, but it does place it within a larger context of spiritual reality that extends beyond individual moral decision-making. It suggests that understanding the human condition requires grappling with spiritual dimensions of reality that are often ignored or oversimplified in contemporary religious discourse. The text's emphasis on the eternal nature of divine law also challenges conventional distinctions between law and grace, between Old Testament legalism and New Testament freedom. If divine law represents the fundamental structure of spiritual reality rather than arbitrary divine commands, then alignment with that law becomes a matter of spiritual health rather than external compliance. This reframes the entire discussion of divine commandments. Instead of viewing God's laws as restrictions imposed on human freedom, Jubileus presents them as descriptions of how spiritual reality actually works. Following divine law becomes a matter of living in harmony with the fundamental principles of creation, rather than submitting to external authority. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of the Book of Jubilees is its implicit critique of religious authority and tradition. By claiming that crucial information has been hidden or forgotten, it suggests that mainstream religious institutions have been inadequate custodians of divine revelation. This isn't just an ancient historical concern. It raises contemporary questions about how religious communities handle texts and teachings that challenge established interpretations. The rejection of Jubileus might represent a pattern of institutional resistance to spiritual insights that threaten conventional authority structures. The Ethiopian Orthodox preservation of this text offers a powerful counter-narrative to assumptions about biblical canon and religious authority. It suggests that authentic Christian tradition might include dimensions that other Christian communities have lost or rejected. The archaeological evidence from Qumran supports this possibility by demonstrating that Second Temple Jewish communities had access to and valued texts that were later excluded from the Hebrew canon. This raises questions about whether the canonical process preserved the most important texts or simply the most politically acceptable ones. These historical considerations don't necessarily invalidate canonical scriptures, but they do suggest that our understanding of biblical truth might be more incomplete than we typically acknowledge. They challenge us to approach religious texts with both respect for tradition and openness to sources of spiritual insight that may have been marginalized by institutional concerns. The Book of Jubilees represents more than just an interesting historical curiosity. It represents a window into alternative ways of understanding divine revelation, cosmic reality, and human spiritual existence. It challenges comfortable assumptions and pushes us to grapple with complex questions about the nature of truth, authority, and spiritual understanding. Whether or not we accept its specific claims, the Book of Jubilees forces us to confront the possibility that our spiritual understanding is more limited and culturally conditioned than we might prefer to admit. It invites us to approach biblical texts with fresh eyes and to remain open to dimensions of divine truth that may have been forgotten or overlooked by mainstream religious tradition. As we conclude this exploration, remember that engaging with challenging religious texts isn't about undermining faith, but about deepening it. The Book of Jubilees, whether you ultimately accept its authority or not, provides valuable insights into how ancient communities understood the relationship between divine revelation and human history. The questions it raises about time, evil, law, and spiritual authority remain relevant for contemporary religious communities. How do we balance respect for tradition with openness to challenging perspectives? How do we discern between authentic spiritual insight and potentially misleading speculation? These are questions that every thoughtful person of faith must wrestle with. The Book of Jubilees doesn't provide easy answers, but it does provide a fascinating case study in the complexity of divine revelation and human understanding. If this exploration has sparked your curiosity about other hidden or controversial religious texts, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss future deep dives into the mysterious corners of biblical and religious literature. And leave a comment letting me know what other topics you'd like me to investigate in this ongoing exploration of texts that challenge conventional religious understanding.